Well, good morning. My name's Landry Jones. I'm the conservation grazing specialist, and with me today is Mr. David Moore, and we are doing a pasture talk episode. This is August 28th. We thought we'd get together and kind of talk about some things that we're seeing across the countryside, around the state, issues that maybe producers are seeing, or upcoming issues that we can maybe get you all out in front of. So when folks do come to the location or come to us for advice, we're kind of ready for that issue. And so right now, like I said, it's late August. There's some things that producers, that our growers could be doing to kind of prep themselves for some fall pasture growth, as well as set them up for success for in the future. A few things that I wanted to kind of hit on, and David, feel free to throw your input in here anywhere you see fit. Um, One thing that so like I said, this is late August. We've been getting a little moisture around our trade territory. We got a little more this weekend, at least it looked like northeast Missouri got quite a bit, and then kind of southwest, south central Missouri got a little bit of moisture come through. But and it finally cooled off. So we're seeing that fall type weather system hopefully kind of stay in place or set itself up, and obviously that's going to lead to some good cool season grass growth. I think we could do a good job right now of putting out some fall fertilizer. And I'll let you, I know you mentioned about the P&K side of things, but where I was going with it, or what I kind of wanted to mention, was the ability to stockpile fescue. I know that you and I had both kind of preached this for a long time. In my opinion, the best attribute that fescue has is the ability to stockpile and retain that quality as it goes into winter. And so right now, the fescue's growing a little bit. It's got a little moisture. We were down to, I think, 61, 62 at my house this morning. It's going to be in the 80s, so that grass is going to think about trying to kick into gear to put in some of that fall growth. So if we haven't clipped those pastures, or if we haven't mowed those pastures or grazed those pastures, now's the time to kind of set those back, get to that 3 to 4 inch height on those grasses if you can, and then put out some nitrogen. Preferably, obviously, we want to protect that nitrogen from any loss. So if it's naked urea, we want to protect it. Super U obviously would be a great product to use, but in that 30 to 50 pound per acre range is kind of that sweet spot. And in my eyes, you can go a little bit higher, but that kind of 40 to 50 pound range, 100 pounds of urea per acre would be a good starting point. And obviously, we want to make sure that we're picking pastures that are predominantly fescue. That's where we're going to retain that quality of that forage. If it's a pasture that has a good mixture, which is not a bad thing, but from stockpiling standpoint, got a good mixture of, say, orchard grass, timothy, it's got some clover in it, it's a very diverse pasture. Those may not be the pastures that we want to actually try to physically stockpile for grazing in December, January, and February, because the quality of the orchard grass, the quality of the clover, obviously, those are going to decline as our winter progresses. That's not to say that we still can't get some fall pasture utilization out of those, and some nitrogen in those situations wouldn't hurt anything. But for physically stockpiling and setting aside until January, February timeframe, those may not be the ones. We want to make sure that we're picking 100% very dominant fescue pastures to stockpile and set aside for that winter grazing. The other thing I would add to that is, if we can have the ability to pick the pastures that we can either reduce access or can strip graze, if we allow animals to have complete access to the field that we're going to stockpile, every time they step on that blade of grass, every time that they lay down on that blade of grass, every time that they urinate or defecate on that blade of grass, we reduce the integrity or the quality of that forage. And so if we can restrict their access, whether it be by strip grazing and moving those strips across the pasture as we graze it, or we've got smaller paddock systems maybe set up where we're allowing them 3-day moves or 2-day moves, we increase utilization rate. So we can go from, if we're doing strip grazing where we're moving those cattle once every day, and I know that's a lot, but a lot of people are out feeding a bale of hay every day. So if we can move cattle once a day, we can get utilization rates upwards of 70 to 80% utilization rates. If we restrict that to where they're only moving cattle, say, once every week or once every 10 days, or they're not moving them at all, then we really start reducing the utilization. We start wasting, half of the grass that's out there, essentially 50% utilization or even lower, 30 to 40% utilization. So that, in my opinion, that's where the value of stockpiling fescue comes, is if we can reduce their access, strip graze. I put some numbers together in a presentation not too long ago, and even adding nitrogen with the cost that it is, adding about 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen and having that daily strip grazing move, we're at about a third of what it costs to feed a round bale of hay. And that's a game changer in today's world. So
absolutely. Landry, you mentioned that it needs to be as close to a pure stand of fescue and that the others don't keep as well. Why don't the other grasses and the clovers keep as well to stockpile?
Yeah, good point. So the fescue has a waxy cuticle. It's got a waxy layer on the outside of its leaf that essentially protects it from degradation, from weather events. Now, if we get a bunch of ice and that ice freezing and thawing, that will break that waxy layer, that waxy cuticle. But that waxiness of that leaf is what helps protect it on into February. I mean, depending on the winter, obviously. But we've tested fescue hay or fescue stockpiled forage before in February that was testing in 10 to 12% protein. And so that's what keeps its quality, is just that waxy cuticle. And in stepping on it, like I mentioned, that's what breaks that waxy cuticle as well. So weather as well as physical damage from an animal is what breaks down that plant, and then that's when you start to decline in quality. So.
Good point. And you bring up the protein and the quality of that grass. I think one of the things that really gets lost among a bunch of people is that the quality of stockpile fescue, even in February, is better than virtually any baled hay we would have to feed. So I encourage people, look at when the protein needs are the highest for your cow herd, feed that stockpile fescue then. Frequently it is February before we really need that. It might we might be able to meet all the needs of dry cows with just hay and not be having to cube them or put tubs out for them at that point in time. But anyway, that's a consideration for sure.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
No, that's so what I was just going to say there. Yeah, just to add on to that, I think there's, it's sometimes a mind shift in management that, if they're going to try stockpiling fescue, and they're spring calving cows, they're dry cows in November, December, January timeframe, where they're really not needing that extra protein, they're really not needing that extra energy, then yeah, I mean, feed hay in the fall when you would be grazing pasture, when the weather conditions are decent. Those animals aren't, they're not trying to find shelter and cover. They don't need that extra energy to get them through the winter. It's nice on us to feed hay in October, November, December than versus January, February, March, and we're rutting up our pastures. And so I think just that whole mind shift of feeding hay early and stockpile later. Now, that's not to say that even myself, I try to keep some hay back for that February, because if we get a late ice storm or a snowstorm that dumps 16 inches, obviously you don't want to feed everything up front, not have anything for kind of an emergency type situation. But that in itself, is that mind shift can help folks a lot and really see the value in stockpiling fescue.
Absolutely. And if you've got wet cows, you can decrease the amount of supplementation you're having to do if you're feeding a premium forage. And in spite of the fact that fescue might be brown, it's pretty doggone good feed. So I think that's important. And when we're thinking about the fertilizer that we put on, Landry mentioned 30 to 50 units of nitrogen. I'm never a fan of putting straight nitrogen out. Let's be sure that we get some phosphorus and some potash on as well. Whether they're trying to meet most of the needs for next year or just get them through this fall with feeding the grass well, getting P&K on in the fall is super important for the quality of grass. Allowing that grass to have ample nutrients to rebuild root systems that have been sorely abused this summer, I think is a really important thing. We could also give some consideration to using impregnated fertilizer, Ultigraze. put our Duracore on the fertilizer and go ahead and start getting some weed control. Now, I want to be careful about how we talk about this and make sure that everybody hears this really well. We're not going to use impregnated fertilizer to control some of the rank weeds that we've got out there that have made it all summer long. Will we kill some of them? Yeah, but we're not going to, get as much control as the customer's really looking for. What we can do, though, maybe we're impregnating sometime in October or November, putting P and K out, allowing those plants to heal themselves over the winter. We can prevent most of the thistles. We can prevent most of the teasel, spotted knapweed, poison hemlock, henbit, chickweed. There's a whole host of things that we can prevent from happening next year. I really, really, really strongly encourage guys that are struggling with pastures that are not clean, or not pastures, hay ground that is not clean, to give some serious consideration to use an impregnated fertilizer in the fall to clean up that hayfield for next year, because it can be done. That's, the residual lasts a long time when we put it on in cool weather. Residual goes away as a result of two things: the amount of water that we receive in the form of rainfall and microbial activity, bacteria. And when the soil temperature cools off, that microbial activity almost comes to a cease. So those bacteria are not gobbling up the herbicide that's left in the soil. That's what allows the residual to carry on for so long. And with not, in spite of the fact we do get muddy sometimes in the wintertime, we really don't get that many inches of moisture that we're pushing it down through the soil profile. So that's a consideration. What else you got on your list, Landry?
Yeah, so really, I think been a lot of discussion of pastures that have suffered through this drought, not only this year, but last year, or folks that were trying to revamp pastures this year, and because of the lack of moisture, didn't get much of a good stand. And so there's a lot of folks that are looking for options as to what can they do with their pasture. One is an emergency type situation where I need to put something in the ground so I can graze it, or graze it this fall and or hay it early next spring. Or is it a type of situation where maybe the pasture was beat up pretty bad, but there's enough there to sacrifice? They're not looking at converting the whole field or reestablishing the whole field. It's just maybe pockets or thin areas that they can do some overseeding in. And so obviously we've got some good cereal grains out there that I look at as kind of that emergency type situation. They can't afford to wait until next year to get some growth or get some production off of those acres. And so folks are going in and maybe planting a rye or wheat or triticale or something like that this fall to get some fall utilization, pasture utilization. And then they're going to come back maybe next summer and do some summer annuals with sorghum sudan or millets, and then come back in and reestablish that pasture next fall. We're still in that count. I mean, we're still in late August, early September, that if somebody wanted to do some perennial grass establishment, there's definitely still time to do that. I've heard you mention before, David, that obviously if we could maybe put some Duracore on 2 weeks ago or 30 days ago to really get some good weed control prior to going in there and planting those grasses, because like you mentioned, a lot of these pastures have if they haven't done anything from a weed control standpoint this spring, there's some issues there. There's going to be some issues for sure this fall and early next spring. And so, evaluate those pastures. And if they're so severe with weeds, it may be one of those that we push off a seeding until next fall. And we prep that ground with some good weed control, and throw in some cereal grains in a sorghum sudan or summer annual next year to kind of really set that place up for success. Because I worry that with as much drought as we've seen in the countryside and folks that are wanting to reestablish pasture, they maybe didn't have that on their forefront of their mind, and they're now sitting in early September saying, I need to get some fescue planted, or I need to convert that back to whatever perennial grass they had in there this fall. And they didn't probably do the steps leading up to where they're at today on August 28th to really put themselves up be successful with their grass stand. So having those conversations with those folks of what's the current situation, is it better to maybe wait until next year to do it? But if not, and they feel like everything's ready to go and they're in pretty good stance, then push them to one of our perennial forages. One thing I wanted to mention from the cereal grain, I looked at the small seed list, which looked like it was updated here just recently, and we're short on some things. We've got some VNS rye. We've got a new product, the Tri-Cal triticale, and then we've got our VNS wheat, and we do have Top Grazer, which I was surprised. Top Grazer was only like $1 a bag more than the VNS. And man, in my opinion, if you're going to push, forage production, why not go with, a good product like that Top Grazer that we know kind of what we're getting out of it for $1 a bag more. That's kind of a no-brainer in my situation, or in my scenario. We do have the oats. We could go that route as well with some Bob or Jerry oats, depending on if they're looking at planting them in this fall or next spring. But anyways, just kind of wanted to throw some of that out there, and at least if they haven't got to thinking about what they're going to do with that pasture this fall or next year, now is the time we've got to start planning for that. Because if not, I'm afraid we're going to have some failures just due to weed competition more than anything.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I'm going to kind of expand on that whole topic. Everybody's probably heard the phrase before: "Start clean, stay clean," and that little phrase got marketed primarily towards row crops, beans and corn, and that if we start with a clean slate, it's a whole lot easier to stay clean. And so I'm going to add on to that and say if we start with a train wreck, we're probably going to end with a train wreck. And in that situation, if there's a train wreck out there of all kinds of weeds, we're not going to get ahead of that in the next 3 weeks and be to a spot where we can plant grass and feel like it's going to be clean. And I think putting it off to next fall is certainly appropriate, Landry, and I'm glad you brought that up. So we can go out there with Roundup and Duracor, and we have to wait 15 days after the day we spray the Duracor to plant. So we're doing okay on time still yet to do that. And it takes Roundup really 2 to 3 weeks to see the full effect of it. So we could conceivably put ammonium sulfate in the tank so that all the Roundup goes to work for us. Put 2 quarts of Buccaneer out there and a pint of Duracor, or even up to 20 ounces of Duracor to extend that residual activity. 2 weeks later, we can plant, and the grass will come, and we've got that residual working from the Duracor to try to keep some of those broadleaf weeds away and keep them from coming. I think that's huge. If they decide they don't want to use Duracor because maybe they want to plant clover this fall, I'm not a fan of planting clovers in the initial planting or the first winter because of the weed control thing. If I put clover out there right now, or even this upcoming February, try to frost seed it, and I get weeds move in, there's an awful lot of people who have the mindset that, oh, I can't spray it because I'll kill my clover that I just planted. Well, let's just put a clean stand of grass out there. And when we get that stand of grass up and it's really doing well, maybe in another year or so, we can plant the clover. But some people will want to do that burn down without having residual activity, in spite of me encouraging them to just plant grass for the time being. So we can use 2,4-D LV, a pint per acre. We have to wait 7 days to plant. A quart per acre, we have to wait 14 days to plant. If you switch that to 2,4-D amine, we have to double those times. A pint means 14 days of waiting. A quart actually on the label says 30 days. So there is a difference between the two of them as to which one gives us the shortest time. It's the LV, or the ester formulation of 2,4-D, that gives us the shortest time. And actually the ester formulation really has the most knockdown power as far as cleaning up out there for us too. So some considerations if you are going to renovate. Landry, what you got next on your list?
That's really all I had. Again, we kind of hit on most things. I was just going to talk about the stockpiling, and yeah, I think I covered most everything. Yeah, that I wanted to cover, David, to be honest with you.
Okay. I just thought of something else that we didn't talk about earlier, and I'll hit it here in just a minute. But before we get going, I want to, there's folks out there that haven't really seen our cheat sheet. The cheat sheet booklet that we've got has in the front of it, Lord, if I could operate it. In the front of it has our spot spray chart. And the next page is our brush cheat sheet. And the next page is our broadleaf weed cheat sheet. The print shop will make those for you. You can go to MyMFA and then click on MyMFA shop and then click on marketing. And these will pop up. The print shop only charges the location for shipping them. There's no charge for printing them. Please take use of that. Make good use of it. The last thing I kind of wanted to talk about, there are people going to be renovating pastures. They're going to be deciding what they want to plant. There's always talk about, well, do I want to plant fescue? That's the toughest thing out there. Do I want to plant orchard grass or some timothy? Or maybe I want to go endophyte free. Let me talk a little bit about endophyte. Our endophyte that's in Kentucky 31 does cause problems for livestock. It causes the endophyte produces a chemical called ergovaline. Ergovaline causes vasoconstriction, causes blood vessels to shrink up, and we get poor blood flow to the animal, parts of the animal in particular. So for cattle, what that really looks like is visibly what we see is maybe a tail switch will freeze off, or the tips of ears will freeze off. In severe cases, we'll lose part of a foot, the lower part of a leg. But what we don't see is decreased milk production, decreased consumption of feed. The cows are running a fever, which produces decreased conception rates. We have decreased average daily gain. What we see is a plant that can survive on a rock. So we've kind of got some give and take. The plant can survive on a rock, but the animals that are consuming it don't gain as efficiently. They're not quite as healthy as animals that are grazing anything other than Kentucky 31. So that leads me down the road. If I'm going to go out there and I'm going to spend the money to put a new stand of grass out there, why don't I look at something other than Kentucky 31? So orchard grass is not toxic. Timothy's not toxic. There's also endophyte free. And I'm going to talk just for a second about that. Endophyte free fescue is just that. It does not have any endophyte living in it. The endophyte is part of what makes Kentucky 31 able to grow on a rock. It can survive our droughts. It can survive being continuously grazed, mob grazed. It just survives. It's very, very tough. Endophyte free doesn't have that. So I kind of lump the endophyte free back into the category of being, as far as endurance, a lot like orchard grass. It gets beat up pretty hard by drought, by hot weather, and doesn't survive very well. But livestock do very well on it because it's not producing a toxin. We do have, though, an opportunity to plant a grass that's very nearly as tough as fescue and does not produce a toxin. And that is novel endophyte fescue. We're just using the word novel to indicate that it does have an endophyte to make that plant tougher than endophyte free. It does not produce a toxin. There are a number of those grasses out there. There's Astantia, there's Max Q, there's Texoma. The one that we handle is called Martin 2 Protec. It's very, very tough. I'm going to say it's 95% as tough as Kentucky 31. However, we do need to treat it a little bit differently, manage it differently than we do Kentucky 31. We can't camp the whole herd out there, and give that herd of cattle an address. This is where they live all the time. They don't ever get moved off of it. That's going to be pretty hard on that grass. But if we're willing to do some rotational grazing, maybe we move those cattle once a week. Maybe we move them twice a week. Whatever, every day is optimum, but not everybody wants to do that. But I think if you're willing to move cattle once a week and not graze it into the ground, that Martin 2 Protec is a very good option, and it's not a whole lot more expensive than Kentucky 31 fescue is. We just need to not graze it much lower than 4 inches before we move them. And I think that's an important take-home point, is that there are options out there. If I add a pound a day of average daily gain to my calves come fall, if I do that for 90 days, 1 extra pound for every 90 days, and these calves are bringing better than $2 a pound, that's $180 to $225 per calf more that I can bring home to my operation just by changing what they graze on. There's a whole lot to be said for that. I would also give some consideration while they're renovating. Don't put it all back in cool season grass. Maybe we say, all right, I've got 50 acres that I'm going to have to renovate this year. I'm going to take part of that and put in a novel endophyte fescue, and I'm going to take part of that, and right now I'm going to put that in wheat or rye or triticale, with the plan of May, I'm going to put that in a native warm season grass. We have got to help to change the mindset of some of our growers that we've got to have something better for our cattle to eat in the summertime. We just have to. Camping them at, there's not a grower out there that doesn't know that his cattle suffered greatly during this summer if all he had for them to eat was Kentucky 31 fescue. They had darn little to eat, and every bite they took was toxic. That's not a good way to feed your cattle. So I'll be happy to help with that. I know Landry will be happy to help with that. Our cheat sheets, by the way, if you give these to growers, my number's on it, Landry's number's on it. It's good for our growers to have those extra contacts. We're available to you all for education anytime. We're available to your producers for education at any time. I really appreciate what all of you do, standing at the counter every day and talking to our growers. So Pasture Talks really comes to you as a result of all the pasture walks that Landry and I do every day. Just give us a holler. We're happy to help.
Well, you were speaking to my heart there on the native warm season grasses. A question I've got for you, David, is if we've got a grower that is hasn't done much up to this point, but wants to reestablish cool season grass in his pasture and heard us talk or seen something about the novel fescue. So he's going from Kentucky 31 to novel fescue. I guess maybe kind of walk us through what that looks like. Is that something that we could do right now, or should we maybe push that off until next year and make sure my concern would be the 31 in there and the seed that's laying in that soil and contaminating that novel. But I guess kind of what's your thoughts on that?
Well, coming on the heels of a drought, we didn't have much seed production this year, which is kind of good for us. In an ideal world, I would say no. Let's spray it with Roundup, try to kill out all the Kentucky 31 that's there. Let's plant that wheat or rye or triticale for this fall. Come springtime, let's plant a summer annual, whether that's millet or sorghum sudan or whatever you want it to be. And then mid-August next year, we go after it with Roundup again. So now we've probably gotten 3 applications of Roundup over the course of a year. We probably have all the Kentucky 31 killed out, or a very, very large percentage of it anyway. And we could look at planting next fall. That being said, I have done a number of times what I call a spray fallow spray application, and I get to the point where I think I've gotten somewhere between 90 and 95% of the Kentucky 31 killed out. In doing that, that would be an application of Roundup plus Duracore, like we talked about a little bit ago. Then I wait somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks. Don't don't disturb the soil. Allow whatever is going to come, and there will be some Kentucky 31 try to regrow. I can go back in, somewhere around the 20th of September, spray that again with just Roundup this time, and plant right in behind that. And I think I've done a pretty good job of displacing the Kentucky 31. I would not try that if we're starting with that train wreck that we talked about before, where weeds are just the dominant thing in the field. I don't think that's a wise idea. I think in that situation, we do put it off till next year. Can it be done? I think if they get after it tomorrow, sure. I think it can be done, and with reasonably good success.
Okay, good, awesome. Well, that's all I've got. Do you have anything more?
I really don't. Call us. We're here to help you. We're doing the most good when our phone's ringing a lot.
Yep. All right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Have a great day.
You as well.